as the UN has been to Israel, don't give up. Don't give up, because we moved mountains over the last 2 years. And I'm not going anywhere, and we're going to continue to fight. So thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
International lawyer, writer, and executive director of human rights NGO UN Watch, Hillel Neuer needs no introduction. Selected as one of the top 100 most influential Jewish people in the world by Israeli newspaper Maariv, Hillel is an outspoken defender of Israel and critic of UN Human Rights Council's actions. One of Israel's greatest champions, and to many of us here tonight, a friend, please welcome to the stage tonight's moderator, our very own homegrown hero, Hillel Neuer.
Thank you.
This is going to be fun.
Well, thank you, Adrian, for that very kind introduction. Ambassador, in August, you graciously hosted me in your country, together with your team at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. And this evening, I have the great honor and privilege to host you in my hometown, together with my team, 1,200 of my closest friends.
I love that. First, let me say, Montreal is beautiful, and I look forward to coming back, so thank you. But please help me give the biggest thank you to Hillel, because let me tell you, you want to look at courage? That is courage. He fights every day, every day. If you aren't following what he does with UN Watch, go find it. Go watch him, because I'm cheering for you every day. You're fighting the good fight, and we need you to keep your energy up and keep going. And if anything starts to go wrong, I got your back.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can't get better support than that. Thank you so much. I just want to say about, by way of introduction for this community, I grew up here, and having traveled the world and having left a number of years ago, I can say it's a unique community. We're in the synagogue that produced Leonard Cohen. He was very close with the synagogue until the day that he died. We're in the community that produced Charles Krauthammer, someone who passed away not long ago, was a great admirer of yours from day one. And it's the community that produced my teacher, Professor Erwin Kotler, one of the great human rights advocates of our time. So I've got a lot of great questions that we want to get to on the UN, Israel, human rights, related issues. But first I need to ask you a question that's on everyone's mind. We miss you so much at the UN. Why did you leave?
Well, I think it's really what I've said. There's no hidden meaning. There's nothing else. As much as you saw what I did in the UN for the last 2 years, I put that same passion and energy into being governor of South Carolina for 6 prior to that. And so in those 6 years, obviously outside of just leading the state that raised me, we had a school shooting, we had a church shooting, we had hurricanes, we had winter storm. There were a lot of tragedies and issues that we had to deal with. And so then when I got to UN, it took it to another level. And so 8 years is a lot. And the one thing I didn't want to do was to try and keep going when I thought someone could do it better and someone could give it more energy than what I could give. And so I have told Ambassador Danny Danone that if he ever has any problems, I will show back up. I will go back to the UN and show back up if it starts to get out of line. So,
well, that's wonderful. I know that you were terrific support for him and his country. What are your plans for the future?
Well, right now I get to talk to normal people, which I love. I'm not talking to Russia and China anymore, so that's really nice. I am in the process of writing a book. It will be out in the fall, and so I'm looking forward to, that's therapeutic. It's great to talk about not just being governor of South Carolina, but you'll hear a lot about the behind the scenes at the United Nations, what those fights were about, why we fought so hard, and where I think that the United States goes as a country forward and leading where we go, but just a lot of other insights with that. So I'm having fun working on that. I've started a policy group that really allows me to continue to have a voice on all policy things, foreign and domestic. If you get a chance, go to www.standforamericanow.com and join, and you can follow all the things that I continue to voice and fight for. And then I'm, obviously spending time with my family. I take care of my parents. They're both in their 80s. They've lived with me for the last 8 years. I have a daughter who's a junior in college. She's a nursing student. I have a son who's a junior in high school, so we're doing college tours with him.
Good ball player?
He's a basketball player, yes. And then obviously my husband, who's a combat veteran, and getting to just make sure that I'm focusing on family and all those things has been really nice.
Terrific. Well, let's start talking a little bit about your work at the UN when it came to the issue of Israel. I think one of the iconic images from your time at the UN was the photo of you at the UN Security Council with your hand raised high, voting no to a draft UN Security Council resolution that would have condemned the United States for having moved its embassy to Jerusalem. It was 14-1. It was you versus the world, and you blocked it. You vetoed the resolution. That photo is such a powerful image. If I could ask you, what was going through your mind at that moment?
Well, first let me say that was one of my proudest moments. Absolutely, without question, one of my proudest moments. I didn't feel like I was standing alone. I felt like I was fighting for the truth and fighting for what was right. And I was mad. I mean, if you look if I gave them the side eye, which I probably did, it was because, look, every country has the sovereign right to put their embassy wherever they choose. The United States chooses to always have its embassy in the capital. So why would we not have it in Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. That's just a fact. But this was so much more than just moving the embassy. This was about telling the truth. And this was about making sure that the rest of the world can't hide what we know as fact, but more importantly, the Palestinians need to acknowledge the fact that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem, and the Arab countries around that needed to acknowledge, quit making the Palestinians think otherwise, and acknowledge what we know is true, and let's do like we do for every other country and put the embassy in the capital, which is what we did. It was something we were so right to do. The president had great courage to do it, and it was just a proud moment. Even if I was standing alone, I knew I was standing for what was right.
Now, the Security Council was a body that you discovered quite quickly had a special focus on Israel. In fact, I will never forget the initial press conference that you gave. I guess it's a briefing to the press, your very first one, that I remember it was written about in the New York Sun. There was an editorial called Halley's Comet. And I read it and I said I hadn't seen it. It hadn't really been published. And I found the video, I put it on the internet, and it just started to explode and go viral. Within a day or two, I could see 7 million views just on our channel. Other people, millions and millions of people saw it. Can you walk us through a bit your first arrival at the Security Council and seeing their particular focus on Israel?
Well, I was very surprised that the video blew up because I wasn't that good. It was really more off the cuff. It was really talking about what I had seen. And one of the things that I did going into the United Nations, I studied a lot of foreign policy, the issues that I knew we would be dealing with and the issues that I knew were important. What I didn't do purposely was study the way the UN worked. And I didn't want to do that because I wanted to go in with fresh eyes. I wanted to go in not tainted with what the status quo had always done. I wanted to go in and just see what I thought. And people don't believe this, I really had no experiences with Israel. I had never been to Israel. I didn't really know much about, I knew the historical things, but I didn't really know a lot about the people of Israel or any of those issues. But what I saw in that council reminded me of what it felt like to be bullied when I was a kid. And I have no patience for bullies. And what I saw in that council wasn't just bullish behavior, it was abusive behavior. They were kicking Israel just because. They didn't even have the facts to do it. It was like fun for them. And for me, it was disgusting. And so that was the reason I went out there, was basically to say, look, we've got a lot of work to do, and there are a lot of issues, but this is one thing we're not going to do. We're not going to have these Israel bashing sessions, and we're not going to continue to allow this abuse to happen. And if you do it, I'm going to call you out on it every single time. I just was trying not to waste my time and let them know now this isn't going to happen anymore. And it did blow up, and I think in some ways that's really sad, because if people celebrate the truth, I mean, my parents always said that's what you do. You shouldn't be surprised by someone telling the truth. This shouldn't be an unusual event for someone to tell the truth. And I think people have to start telling the truth about Israel, because they're thinking it, they're just not saying it. And I think that was a lot of what I wanted to happen, was let's start calling this out for what it is. And what we did over time, those Israel bashing sessions, they would bash and I would talk, because it was supposed to be a session on the Middle East, I would talk about lots of other things like Hamas and like what was happening in Lebanon and what was happening in Yemen, and go into all of these other issues. So they would all go and talk about Israel and I would talk about my issue. And then over time, it started to stop.
You brought up Hezbollah, you brought up ISIS, the real issues in the Middle
All
East.
of those things that really were important that we needed to discuss. And so what you saw were ambassadors started to be somewhat embarrassed if they were to say something. We certainly didn't stop it, but it really changed the tone of what was happening in those sessions. And I still think we have a long way to go, but I think it was very telling at how they realized after being called out how wrong it was.
Now, you're in those sessions and you're seeing this extraordinary, peculiar treatment of one country, the Jewish state. You must have wondered to yourself, why is this happening? Why are these countries going along? Can you sort of walk us through your understanding of why this bizarre treatment recurs in such an extreme degree?
I mean, I think that after the 1967 war, a lot of the Middle East and the Arab countries realized you can't beat Israel. They're too tough. They couldn't beat them that way, so they said, let's beat them diplomatically. And so they started doing it through the UN. And they did it in a way that just started to infiltrate. And if you look at the Arab countries, they have a lot of oil, they have a lot of money, and so they started picking up all of these other countries to vote with them. And I think that's how this started. If you actually go into the quiet corners of the UN, most countries don't hate Israel. They really don't. Most countries envy Israel. Most countries think Israel is valuable. They just don't know how to say it or how to vote against it, because those Arab countries continue to put pressure on them. But the other side of it is the Arab countries know it. We were having a meeting on Yemen, and I was meeting with a couple of the Arab countries, and they were saying, I don't know why no one calls out the Houthis. I don't know why they acknowledge them. This isn't a real group. All they do is they call it this terrorist activity. They were saying all these things. And I literally was distracted by it. And I said, I'm sorry, I know we're talking about Yemen, but everything you just explained is no different than what Hamas is doing with Israel. I said, it's the exact same story. And they were just quiet. After that, they took me to the side and they said, we know you're right. We know you're right. And I said, then why do it? What's with all the resolutions? Why do it? And they said, we do it for our constituencies. We just have to keep doing it to show them that we're doing something. So the real leadership needs to come from the Arab communities. The real leadership needs to be from those Arab countries who know now that Israel isn't the one doing all of this, that Iran is the one that's doing this. They feel it, they're suffering because of it, and we've got to keep the pressure on them to acknowledge it. I think we're going to get there, I really do.
And well, speaking about the Arab regimes, there is this odd disconnect where at the UN, like you said, they are leading the resolutions against Israel in every possible UN forum. And yet we know in the region, governments like Egypt are very close militarily with Israel. There are reports of significant improvements in relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. There are public things we know about the Israeli anthem being played at sports matches in the United Arab Emirates, in Qatar most recently. So clearly in the region, there are a number of developments that are positive, yet at the UN, there still is this sort of public show for their constituencies. What's your sense of the Arab-Israeli relationship on how we could get some of the public actions to match those things in private? Did you have any visibility on that?
What's very telling is after I left the UN, probably about a month and a half ago, you'd probably know better, the Emirati ambassador sent me the video of the Israeli anthem being played at that sports event. Now, how telling is that? She sent it because I think they're proud. She sent it because I think she sees that we're moving the ball. I think what we have to do, though, is continue to let them know there is no way out to continue to go. It's not sustainable. The problem is we have to get the Palestinians to the table. We've got to have a conversation, and the Arab communities have to tell them the truth. Because if I can see a difference in them at the UN, if I can see that they're trying to show me that they're changing, we need the leadership. We need the governments to start moving in that direction. And I think I'm not saying anything about the election, so don't get mad at me. But I will tell you, Netanyahu has done a very good job of reaching out to Russia, reaching out to Saudi Arabia, reaching out to those countries. And what he needs to do, what I hope he does, is follow up on it. So meeting with them and having those relationships is one thing. But if they do something, he needs to call them. He needs to say, wait a minute, you can't tell me one thing behind closed doors and then turn around and do something else. I think that's the next step. But I really do believe we're going to get there. Because I think if you've got Arab ambassadors sending me videos and sending me text messages about the progress they're making in their country when it comes to Israel, I just think that's huge.
Absolutely. Now, you spoke about the UN Security Council, and of course the UN is a bit complex. There are some UN bodies, like the Security Council, where the United States has a veto, and thank God for that.
But so does Russia, and that's just no good.
Them's the breaks. But of course, in other bodies, there is no veto, whether it's the General Assembly in New York or other bodies in Geneva, and we'll come to that. But let's talk about the General Assembly, because there were resolutions that you were able to veto in the Security Council. They went to the GA. There is this automatic majority. In the General Assembly, is the U.S. limited to playing defense? Is there anything the U.S. could do when it comes to the resolutions on Israel?
Well, the U.S. did it. You've had over 600 resolutions against Israel. And for the first time, we got a majority to recognize that Hamas was a problem in Israel. That had never happened before. A majority of the General Assembly acknowledged that. And so, literally, they had never acknowledged Hamas before. So to suddenly say, after all of this time, yes, they're causing problems, yes, they're part of the problem, I think that, again, we're moving the ball. We just have to keep doing that. You know, we won the majority last time. Next time, I want us to win a whole resolution. I want us to push it even further. But I do think we just have to keep going. And I think when I got there, my first meeting, the first ambassador I wanted to meet with was Danny Danone. And it was from a personal disappointment of what had happened with Resolution 2334. The resolution that was just, it went against Israel at a time that Israel really needed the U.S. And
This is, of course, the resolution in the final days of the Obama administration,
Yes.
which they allowed to pass, and which recognized or declared that the old city of Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory, including the holy sites of Judaism.
it was terrible, but what was worse was after I had done some asking of ambassadors, the U.S. led that resolution. Other countries actually didn't want to do it, and the U.S. led that. So I was going into the UN with so much disappointment, and then when I met with Ambassador Danone, to hear what he went through, when that resolution was there at the Security Council, and he was there, and everybody voted against Israel, and then your one true ally, the one that's always supposed to be there for you, abstained, that wasn't hurtful enough. But everyone on the council and everyone in the audience stood up and applauded. And Danny's just sitting there. It was the United States' saddest hour. And so I told him, I said, I want you to know right here, right now, that will never happen again under my watch. We will never allow that to happen. But what was fun was to see his strength over time and to see the Israeli mission build up over time and, you know, and to really see him find his own force. And I think you've got an Israeli mission now at the United Nations that's strong and that's fighting back and that's literally standing with confidence and feeling good about it. And I hope that that continues. But it's a reminder again, don't ever look away, don't ever let your guard down, because we always have to be conscious of those things, because it only takes one time to set everything back. And I think that Israel has earned the right to stand on its own. Israel has earned the right to call people out. And Israel has earned the right because it's a good, strong country that I truly look at as a beacon of light in a neighborhood that has a lot of problems.
Just to follow up on something you said, the Obama administration officials have insisted that they were passive. The resolution came to them and they judged it and they waited, and the last moment they saw it and they made their decision. That was not what you learned?
True. No, it's not true. I mean, literally, and they know it's not true, and I don't think that they can deny it. There's too many witnesses. I mean, literally, you can go to too many ambassadors and they will tell you it was uncomfortable. Some of them did not want to go through with it. I don't know what that was about. I don't know the motive. I don't know why that happened. But for representing the United States, if you don't have the backs of your friends, why would anybody trust you? Why would anybody think that you would have the backs of them? So I saw this as a true issue that the United States had to deal with. Yes, it was bad for Israel, but this was even worse for the United States. And then we have plenty of enemies and plenty of countries that give us challenges. The last thing we need to do is go against one of our own. And Israel is one of our own.
And I have to say that that's a resolution we're still paying the price for it. There's
Absolutely.
mechanisms that keep operating at the UN, invoking that awful text. I want to look at a few of the UN bodies that you interacted with. As you know, the United Nations has one refugee agency for the world. It's across the street from me in Geneva. It's called the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. But then there's a whole other agency only for Palestinian refugees, as they're called, which gives them education and all kinds of social services. And I just want to read to you what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who was just in Jordan this weekend, what he said about UNRWA. He said that the UNRWA students are learning about democracy. At UNRWA, they're learning about human rights, they're learning about tolerance, they're making the conditions to be exemplary citizens. This is something, he said, that warms my heart. Do you feel the same way about UNRWA?
No, not at all. And this, again, understand that I learned this as going through the process. So when I saw UNRWA, of course, when you see a refugee organization, you think it's there to do good, it's there to provide benefits to those who can't provide for themselves. When I got to the UN and I was fighting for Israel just because I thought it was the right thing to do, I finally told my staff, I said, I think I need to visit Israel. I'm sitting here fighting for a country I've never been to. So I went to Israel, went to every aspect of it, went to the UNRWA camps, went and saw what they do and how they do it. They have the potential to do good. But what I, towards the end, really told the UNRWA officials is they have to reform this agency. What they're doing is they're growing refugees over time to infinity. No other country does that. No other organization does that, and it's not sustainable. The second thing that I noticed over the time was they always said that they were running out of money. If we don't get money, the schools are going to close. We have to get money so the schools close. Happened over and over again. And so the U.S. State Department would say, you got to give UNRWA money. Well, to me, when you looked at it, UNRWA needed to be reformed. Why do we keep giving more money? How are you spending that money? So we start looking at how it's spending. We look at their textbooks. We look at the way they're teaching. I went and saw the paintings on the wall in the UNRWA camps and all of those things. I mean, you can tell there is a toxic situation there. So I went to the president and I said, I don't think we should give UNRWA any money anymore. And
it's a lot of money. It's just $300–400 million a year. It's a huge amount.
It is. And he said, and there were others in the administration that disagreed with me. And I said, just trust me on this. Don't give any money, and I bet you the schools won't close. This is a fundraising mechanism, I'm convinced. I said, just do this. Well, the Secretary of State at the time, the president said, okay, let's not give any money. Secretary of State at the time went ahead and gave half, even though the president told him not to. It was probably the best thing that ever happened because after he gave half, I got to call the president and he said, Nikki, I told Rex not to give that money. He goes, I can't believe he gave the money. I said, no, but let me tell you what happened. I said, we didn't get a thank you note from UNRWA. They didn't call us and say, we appreciate it. I said, they held a protest in the streets blaming the U.S. for not giving more. And that was it. The president said, I'm done, no more, we're not going to do it. So we cut all the funding to UNRWA, and guess what? The schools still have not closed. But we went a step further. This is not the U.S. trying to be harsh or hateful. That was not the case. We want to look, the Palestinians deserve a better life. They do. And that's why I feel so strongly about the peace plan. That needs to happen. But UNRWA it's not being honest with the people it serves, and it's not being honest with the people giving the money. But this is where I went further. At a Security Council meeting, because the U.S. was getting criticized heavily from every country in the world for the fact that we weren't giving UNRWA money, I listed out every amount of money that every Arab country was giving UNRWA. Combined, it didn't match what the U.S. was giving.
Including all the oil-rich countries.
Including all of them. And I called each one out and said, if you truly cared about the Palestinians, and if you truly think UNRWA is so great, why aren't you stepping up? Why aren't you taking care of them? It's not America's problem to take care of this situation.
All right, we spoke about one of the UN agencies. I need to speak to you about one UN official. There's a very nasty UN official, was there for many years.
Which one?
Richard Falk. Richard Falk, the fellow who in 1979 wrote an op-ed in the New York Times called Trusting Khomeini, saying how Khomeini's new Iran would be a model of democracy. When he was UN rapporteur on Palestine for 6 years, he supported Hamas. He promoted the 9/11 conspiracy theory. He was actually called out on that by Ban Ki-moon. And eventually he had to retire from being a UN monitor on Palestine. But then a UN agency based in Beirut pulled him out of retirement and had him write a report, 25 pages, on how Israel's an apartheid state. The report was published. You had just come to the UN, and you did something that caused the UN to delete the report, something I have never seen. How did you do that? How did you do it?
That was so fun. You know, when that report came out, it was so ridiculous. I mean, really, the UN does a lot of ridiculous things. But when we saw that, and we saw that the UN had published it, and it was under a UN organization, I mean, the very first thing we did was I called the Secretary General, and I said, this is absolutely ridiculous. We pitched such a fit that not only did they denounce the report, but the head of the organization that released the report, she's no longer there anymore. She was fired the next day, or released the next day.
Speaking of the Palestinians, I want to say a word or two about the PA. I mean, the America and the West have given billions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority over many years, yet they continue to fund terrorists. I'd like to get your thoughts. What can we do to change things at the PA? And specifically, the PA had some sharp words about you. Did that bother you?
No, it did. Look, it didn't bother me. I mean, I think that, you know, they told me to shut up or something like that. And, you know, I'm not going to. My husband will tell you it's impossible. I don't shut up. Look, when it comes to the Palestinians, again, I'm going to speak from the truthful side of me. I pray for a peace deal. I don't just pray it for Israelis, I pray it for Palestinians. I pray for the fact that all of this just finds its own place. The only two sides that can decide this are the Israelis and the Palestinians. The U.S. doesn't need to do this, but we do need to bring them to the table. And as long as Abbas is there, it's never going to happen. I mean, it's just never going to happen. And as long as the Arab countries continue to appease him and make him think that he has the right to do this and say the thing, it's not going to happen. But we do want to see the quality of life for Palestinians get raised. We do want to see children get an education. We do want to see health care for everyone. We do want to see all of those things happen, but not at the expense of the security of Israel. And so our focus, the administration's focus, my focus while I was at the UN, was very much on Iran. I mean, the focus has to be on Iran. It's the #1 threat we have in the world. And if you look at what happened with Iran prior to the Iran deal, they were causing trouble. Then the Obama administration gave them a plane full of money, literally. And what happens? They're no longer causing problems in their own little world. All of a sudden, they're helping the Houthis in Yemen. They're helping Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're getting involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. And now we see Iran's tentacles have gone everywhere. And I think one of the best decisions that the president and the administration made was get out of the Iran deal, because that was the bigger threat to what was happening. And what we've seen happen from getting out of the Iran deal is the revenues drying up. And not only can Iran not do the things that they were doing, which, by the way, violations of resolutions left and right on support of terrorism, selling of arms to terrorist groups, ballistic missile testing, they were violating all these resolutions that no one would acknowledge. But by us drying up that money, we didn't just dry up money for the bad acts that they were doing. They can't help Assad in Syria anymore. They don't have the money to pay those soldiers. All of the money that they were giving to these other groups is starting to dry up, which means we're weakening them one step at a time. That's good for Israel, that's good for the United States, that's good for everyone that wants peace in the world.
Speaking of Iran, about a year or two ago, Iran was crushing peaceful protesters in the streets of Iran in maybe 80 different cities. And the United States was the first country to call an emergency meeting at the United Nations. And yet, a number of European democracies opposed that move. I think countries like Sweden, I think Sweden said they disagreed with the timing and format of the meeting on Iran as they were literally crushing peaceful protesters. So I wonder at the UN, did you find it perhaps sometimes more frustrating than dealing with China and Russia on Syria than perhaps, was it more frustrating to deal with EU allies on an issue like Iran?
I think it was equally frustrating. I think, but the frustration in dealing with the Europeans and the reason that was tough was they were not wanting to do anything against Iran because they didn't want the Iran deal to be shaken. They were all so proud that they all came together and got this deal. Well, deals are great, but if you don't go back and look and see if the deal is working and if it's right, then you're not doing your job. And the Europeans, their egos were so big, they just couldn't face the fact that maybe the coalition, including the United States, made a mistake. And clearly that's what happened. And so I think that they were tiptoeing around Iran, and they were trying, not to cause any problems. And I think when we came out and removed ourselves from the deal, they still tried to see if they could make it work. And I think recently you saw they're trying to do some sort of barter system with Iran. It's not working. And you're watching this fall apart. And I think as it's falling apart, you will start to see the Europeans call out Iran again. I think this was all in the name of saving the deal. This was all in the name of trying to keep it legitimate. This was definitely the EU trying to prop it up. And I think that, the idea was this was a bad deal. It was bad for the world. It was good for Iran, and it needed to be changed. And I think the Europeans will come around. But yes, it was frustrating.
Which we did see a little bit after dissidents started to get assassinated in The Hague and in Denmark. The Europeans finally had to say something about Iran.
I think it's really important. We have to remember that the Iranian regime is not at all related to the Iranian people. They so desperately want a democracy. They so desperately want all of the leadership to go away. And they really are fighting for their lives every single day. And so, we need to keep fighting for the Iranian people. We need to keep fighting for their voice and what they're trying to get in their country because they do deserve it.
Coming back to the UN, there's a question that I think everyone would like to know from an expert such as yourself. We talked about how Israel is condemned 20 times every year by the UN General Assembly, when at most there's one resolution on some of the worst regimes like Iran, Syria, or North Korea. So we know that's absurd, but I think people wonder, do UN resolutions matter? What impact do they have, if any at all?
I don't think they matter. I don't. This is one of the interesting conversations. After I had been at the UN a year, the president, we were meeting on something, and he said, "So Nikki, what do you think? Should we stay in? Should we get out? What do you think? You've been there a year." And I said, ultimately the American people are going to have to decide, but this is the way I see it. It's heavily bureaucratic. It's doubled in size in the last 10 years of people that they've hired. And the only reason they hire them is because every country is fighting to have more of their people in the UN. So it's not ever reducing, it's just getting bigger. It's extremely wasteful. The money that is spent, they are in the process of a reform, but it's got so far to go. We were able to cut $1.3 billion in just the first year, and that was a drop in the bucket. So it's got a long way to go on the spending. It's heavily political. They love to talk. They don't ever want to do anything. So there's a lot of negatives, the Russian veto, there's a lot of negatives that I can say. But we would not have gotten those 3 North Korean sanctions packages. We would not have been able to isolate North Korea had it not been for the UN. Because the entire international community came together in the name of stopping the testing, in the name of stopping the nuclear weapon development, and it brought Kim to the table. So, it's a really hard thing. It was the UN came together with good intentions, right? You put everybody in a room, you make them look at each other in the face, all in the name of peace and security. The only way the UN will be effective is if it changes with the times. If it continues to go and call out Israel, when we have issues in Syria and North Korea and Afghanistan and Africa and all of these, if it continues to do that, it's weakening itself. It's just becoming irrelevant. If it continues to do resolutions that blames the U.S. for moving its embassy to Jerusalem, we're not moving it back. That doesn't make us do anything. And so, look, the U.S. was condemned plenty of times as well at the United Nations. Didn't bother us any. Our goal is to, at the UN, at least what I tried to do was make sure everyone knew what the U.S. was for, what the U.S. was against, and what our end goal was. And I tried to be very honest and clear on every issue. And then I also tried to lead on where the U.S. thought things should go and how they should happen. That's the forum I chose to use with the UN because I don't think it's very effective doing anything else.
Now, speaking of spotlighting abusers, you tried something creative at the UN. Every year there's a resolution that condemns America for the embargo on Cuba, but you introduced...
Can you say that again? Every year there's a resolution that blames the U.S. for the poverty and human rights situation of Cuba. Let's just soak that in. And they've done that for 21 years. Go ahead.
And yet, for the first time, you introduced 8 amendments that spotlighted Cuba's gross and systematic abuses using language that I believe European countries had expressed in other fora. Not very many countries went along, and our own country, Canada, voted no on each of those. One of the only democracies in the world that voted no on each of your 8 amendments for Cuban human rights. How did you understand Canada's vote? What were your feelings on that?
I was disappointed, but I was disappointed in a lot of countries. First of all, I'll tell you, I am dear friends with the Canadian ambassador, Marc Andres.
You even had a bet on bagels.
I'm sorry?
You had a bet on Montreal bagels.
We
I think
did.
You won.
I won. Look, he's a great person. I think that every country has its own reasons for doing things. Canada's running for the Security Council. And again, that's another set of politics that when you're doing that, you tend to walk that line. Yes, I was disappointed. I was disappointed in a lot of different countries. But that's politics, and that's the UN.
Ambassador, unfortunately, we're out of time. I just want to say that I know I speak on behalf of everyone here when I say that faced with an assembly of dictators and their apologists, in your time at the UN, you stood up for moral clarity, you stood up for truth. You did so with extraordinary courage, and we thank you for everything you did. We thank you for your leadership, and we wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's fun. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.